Welcome back to the channel. I'm Preston Moore, and in today's video, I'll be shooting several different lots of AAC 77 grain OTM and looking over the groups and velocities to see if there are any differences in performance. I intended to put out this video a while ago as a follow-up to my first review on this ammo. However, there have been several changes with this ammo that have caused some delays. So, we'll go over a short history to get everyone up to speed and get a better understanding of what I'm doing. I believe this ammo came out in early 2023. It seemed to have a decent reputation, although there were also reports of quality control issues and variations in velocity and group performance. The first time I shot this ammo was in mid-2024, and I posted my first video on this ammo in May of 2025. Right around that time, PSA reported having difficulty sourcing powder and temporarily suspended production of the 2700 foot per second rated 77 grain OTM and introduced a 2550 feet per second version. I had completed filming a version of this video with multiple lots of the 2550 load, but right as I was getting ready to edit the video, I saw that PSA re-release the 2700 foot per second version, so I bought a few more boxes of that to include in this video. We have a few different lots to compare to one another. I'll also be comparing the 77 grain OTM to another AAC load, the 75 grain BTHPs, as well as some other 77 grain loads from other manufacturers like IMI Razor Core, Federal Gold Medal, and PMC X-Tac Match to see how everything stacks up against each other. I am mostly going to be shooting everything through two different 20-inch H-bar barrels to compare the groups and velocity numbers, since the advertised velocity is based on a 20-inch barrel. I'll also be doing a POI shift with a 16-inch Roscoe barrel, and at the end, I'll shoot the newest lot of 77 grain OTM that I have through a variety of different barrel lengths to get some more velocity numbers. As stated earlier, I have two 20-inch H-bar barrels for this test. The first one I have is from Bear Creek Arsenal, and it's made from 416R stainless steel, has a 223 wild chamber, and 1-8 twist. The build quality for this barrel is definitely on the lower end, but it actually put up some pretty decent groups during a solo video I did on it a while ago. The other 20-inch H-bar is from Red Right Hand LLC, and it's made from nitride-treated 4150 chrome moly vanadium steel with a 556 NATO chamber and 1-7 twist. And here's a look at some of the groups that I shot with this barrel. If you want to see more about the specifics on this barrel, you can check out the video I did on it a few weeks ago. Anyway, there are a few similarities and differences between the specs of the barrels. Obviously, they are both 20-inch H-bars, but they have different chambers, they're made from different materials, and they also have different twist rates. So, we'll be able to see if those differences might lead to a change in the velocity or performance of this ammo. Regarding the shooting setup, the groups will be shot from the prone with a front rest and a rear bag. The handguards are fitted with a 3-inch front bag rider to better fit the front rest. The SBR lower is fitted with an A5 buffer system with an A5-2 buffer, Sprinco green spring, and AR Gold trigger. No muzzle device is used to prevent possible interference. Each group is 30 shots. This simulates a match or other practical type scenario where the barrel will get some heat into it, and also gives us a decent sample size to work with. Between each group, I used a chamber chiller and leaf blower for cooldown. Distance was 100 yards. Point of aim was a small circle at the bottom of the target. Point of impact was set a few inches higher to preserve the aiming point. Wind was monitored with a ribbon. Each 30-shot group took about 4 minutes to shoot and was edited down to about 25 seconds. A Garmin Zero C1 Pro chronograph was used to collect velocity data. A Mantis X10 Elite, as well as a Shooter's Global SG Pulse, are mounted to the rifles to keep track of rifle stability and detect any possible shooter-induced flyers. Groups were measured using the Ballistic X app. The BCA 20-inch H-bar was mounted to an upper from Bad Attitude Department with a Psionics bolt carrier group, Expo Arms handguard, and used a 7-35x56 scope that was provided by D&T Optics. The LMG H-bar, which was donated to the channel by Cody at Red Right Hand LLC, was mounted in an upper from Air Precision with a Psionics bolt carrier group, Expo Arms handguard, and used a 5-30x56mm scope that was provided by Discovery Optics, which has a 34mm main tube, Ultra HD glass, and is recoil rated up to 50 BMG. Alright, so first we'll be shooting the BCA barrel with two different lots of the 2700 foot per second box of AAC 77 grain OTM. Alright, so we have one lot from March of 2025, which is on the top of the screen, and the other lot on the bottom of the screen is from October of 2025. There was a bit of time between shooting these two groups because I didn't plan on doing the October lot, since I didn't know that PSA had reintroduced the 2700 foot per second load. but that's how it goes. Anyway, shooting went well on my end for both groups, meaning that I felt good about every shot and don't think I pulled any of the shots. The wind was calm for this group, ejection looked fairly consistent, the Garmin chronograph picked up velocity for every shot, and the Mantis missed a few shots, but everything went pretty well. So we will finish up the group and then take a closer look. All right, here's an overview of the velocity numbers. And looking at the average velocities, according to the box, we should be getting 2,700 feet per second. And we got 2,628 feet per second from the older lot and 2,728 feet per second from the newer lot from October. So 100 feet per second difference between the two lots. The newer lot was closer to the advertised velocity. I suppose that's promising. Moving on to the velocity standard deviations, the older lot from March had a pretty bad SD of 30 feet per second, and the newer lot looks pretty good, with an SD of 19 feet per second. Moving on to the individual velocity numbers for both lots, shot 6 on the older March 2025 lot was particularly slow, at 102 feet per second slower than average, but other than that, nothing really sticks out with the individual velocity numbers. And then looking at the rifle stability data, I had average rifle stability scores of 99.6 and 99.7, without any unexpectedly low scores. So that basically means that I don't think I pulled any of the shots, and that I shot both lots about as equally as I could. Looking at the groups, the older lot looks to be pretty well distributed, but not exactly the tightest group, and the newer lot from October had a nice little cluster going, but a few shots ended up meandering out to the left. So there isn't an overwhelming difference between these two groups, but still a pretty clear difference, and we'll look at some numbers here in a second. Before going over the group numbers, I'll briefly explain my AZ score, which is how I like to evaluate groups. AZ stands for A-zone equivalence distance, and it's based on the mean radius, which is the average distance that each shot is from the center of the group. This makes the AZ score more resistant to one flyer wrecking the group. I then multiply the mean radius by 4, and then calculate the maximum distance where that group size would still fit into a USPSA A-zone. To me, this just puts things in an easier to understand context, so that I can have a better grasp on the practical implications of the group. Anyway, the older lot shot a bit worse, with a 30-shot group size at 2.640 MOA and a mean radius of 0.745 MOA, which gives us an AZ score of 189 yards. And the newer lot shot a bit better, with a 30-shot group size at 2.310 MOA and a mean radius of 0.592 MOA, which gives us an AZ score of 238 yards. Or, if you want some more conventional numbers to look at, if we take the 30-shot group and break it down into 3 10-shot groups, the older lot had an average 10-shot group size of 2.1 MOA, and the newer lot had an average 10-shot group size of 1.6 MOA. So there does appear to be a bit of a difference between the two lots, particularly in the velocity, but also in the groups as well. And with that, we will now look at two lots of the 25-50 feet per second load. Alright, so these two groups aren't entirely relevant, since AAC no longer makes this version of their 77 grain OTM, but since it was loaded by AAC, we can still get some insight into how much of a difference there might be between different lots of ammo loaded by them. So there is some usable information here. Anyway, shooting felt fine again on my end. Wind was pretty minimal for both groups, so we shouldn't have an issue there. The Garmin chronograph picked up velocities on every shot, and the Mantis missed a few shots here and there. So we will finish up the group and then take a closer look. All right, here is the velocity data chart for the two different lots of AAC 77 grain OTM that was loaded to an advertised velocity of 2,550 feet per second. And both of these groups were shot on the same day, so there should be minimal environmental difference between these two groups. And looking at the average velocity, both are quite a bit higher than the 2550 feet per second that they're supposed to be. And on top of that, there is a 75 foot per second difference between the two lots, which I would consider a pretty big difference. Looking at the velocity SDs, the May lot had a standard deviation of 20 feet per second, and the July lot was a bit worse at 27 feet per second. Looking at the individual velocities, shot 29 on the July lot was particularly fast at 74 feet per second faster than average, but other than that, nothing else looks out of place. And then looking at the groups, they mostly look pretty similar to each other, except for the 3 shots that hit low with the May lot. Moving on to the numbers, the May lot ended up with a 30-shot group size of 2.779 MOA and a mean radius of 0.646 MOA, which gives us an AZ score of 218 yards. And the July lot did just a little bit better with a 30-shot group size of 1.995 MOA and a 30-shot mean radius of 0.634 MOA, which gives us an AZ score of 223 yards. And if we look at the 10-shot breakdown, the May lot had an average 10-shot group size of 1.8 MOA, and the July lot also had an average 10-shot group size of 1.8 MOA. They kind of got there in slightly different ways, though. Anyway, again, there is a pretty decent difference in the velocities between these two lots, but the groups were pretty similar. Next up, we'll switch out the barrels to see if there's any changes. Alright, so here are two lots of the 2550 feet per second version of the 77 grain OTM. These are the same two lots that I shot with the BCA barrel. So we can compare with that barrel if we want to. And there are a few differences between barrels. This H-bar is from Red Right Hand LLC and has a 556 NATO chamber, 1-to-7 twist, and is made from nitride treated 4150 chromoly vanadium steel. The BCA was a 223 wild chamber, 1-to-8 twist, and 416R stainless. Anyway, everything went fine with these groups. Shooting felt good on my end. The wind was fine. No malfunctions. The Garmin missed one shot with each group, which is pretty rare, but that happened. And I think that's about it. So we will finish up here and then take a closer look. All right, here are all the velocity numbers. And if we look at the average velocities, the advertised velocity for these lots is 2,550 feet per second. And we got a decent amount higher than that with both lots. The July lot was 60 feet per second faster than it should have been, with an average velocity of 2,610 feet per second. And the May lot was 34 feet per second faster, with an average velocity of 2,644 feet per second. So a difference between the two lots, but not a huge difference. Moving on to the velocity SDs, the May lot had an SD of 16 feet per second, and the July lot had an SD of 26 feet per second. So a decent difference there. Looking at the individual velocities, nothing looks particularly out of place. And then moving on to the groups, we have some pretty obvious things to look at. Shot 27 on the May lot sailed off into a completely different zip code. I'm confident that wasn't me. The shot looked and felt fine on my end, and both the Mantis and SG Pulse looked fine. That shot just took a left turn apparently. So that was pretty interesting. Shot 3 on that group also drifted a little bit high right. And then the group from the July lot didn't have any of those super weird flyers. But there were a few that drifted a little high and a little bit low. Moving on to the group numbers, the May lot had a 30-shot group size of 4.348 MOA and a 30-shot mean radius of 0.642 MOA, which gives us an AZ score of 220 yards. And the July lot had a 30-shot group size of 3.302 MOA with a 30-shot mean radius of 0.768 MOA, which gives us a bit lower AZ score at 184 yards. And the average 10-shot group size for both groups was 2.4 MOA. And again, they kind of got there in quite different ways. So with this barrel, there was a 34 feet per second difference in the average velocities, and the groups were both kind of weird, but relatively in the same ballpark, kind of. Next up, we'll see how this barrel does with the May 2025 lot. All right, this is the only 2,700 foot per second rated 77 grain OTM lot that I shot out of this barrel. So we'll just get a baseline and see if the velocity matches up with the advertised velocity, and then see what the group numbers look like. I suppose we could also compare to the BCA barrel as well. Anyway, shooting went good on my end with this one. No malfunctions. Wind was calm, per usual. The Garmin picked up all the shots, and the Mantis missed only one shot. So we will finish up and then take a closer look. All right, so the advertised velocity out of the red right hand barrel was 2,706 feet per second, which is right on with the advertised velocity. So that's pretty awesome. And the standard deviation was also really good at 15 feet per second. The velocity numbers look great for this lot out of this barrel as well as the BCA. Looking at the individual shot velocities, nothing looks out of place. And then looking at the group, it looks about as tall as it is wide, and no wild flyers like the last groups. So this is also looking pretty good. 30-shot group size came in at 1.912 MOA with a 30-shot mean radius of 0.516 MOA, which gives us an AZ score of 273 yards. And looking at the 10-shot breakdown, the first 10 shots went into a sub-MOA group, which is pretty neat. And then the average 10-shot group size was 1.3 MOA. So quite a bit better than the previous lots of the 2550 feet per second load. Next up, we're going to do a POI shift test and also look at some more comparative velocities with a 16-inch Roscoe purebred barrel. All right, I'm shooting 3 different lots of AAC 77 grain OTM, and they are all the 2700 foot per second rated version. I have lots from March, April, and October of 2025, and I did 10 shots with each lot, with a full cooldown between each group, shot the same target with the same point of aim, didn't touch the scope, and we'll see where they all land. All right, so here's a replay of the group, broken up into 10-shot groups, and you can see that the first 2 overlap each other pretty well, and the third group shifts up and to the right a bit. We'll put some numbers on this in a minute, but we're going to look at the velocities real quick. Here's the velocity and rifle stability data for all 30 shots, and you can see from the color scale that shots 1 to 20 were all pretty much in the same ballpark, and then the velocity jumps up quite a bit for shots 21 to 30. Also, one thing to note is that shot 13 was particularly slow. The average velocity for all 30 shots across 3 different lots out of this 16-inch barrel was 2,525 feet per second, with an SD of 72 feet per second and an extreme spread of 212 feet per second. So not much consistency between the lots. All right, sticking with the velocities, shots 1 to 10 were from the lot I purchased in March of 2025, 11 to 20 were from a month later in April, and shots 21 to 30 were from the October lot. And all of these were in boxes that were rated at 2,700 feet per second out of a 20-inch barrel. Looking at the average velocities, the first 2 lots were really close, with only an 8 feet per second difference. So that's 2,472 feet per second versus 2,480. And then the newest lot from October was about 150 feet per second faster at 2,622 feet per second. So quite the difference there. Also, when I did my review on this barrel, I shot AAC 77 grain OTM through it, and I purchased that lot in July of 2024. And that lot had an average muzzle velocity of 2,557 feet per second with an SD of 16, which again is pretty inconsistent with the other lots that we're seeing here. Looking at the group numbers, the 10-shot groups were all remarkably consistent at 1.6, 1.7, and 1.6 MOA. So not much of a difference there. And then looking at the POI shift at 100 yards, only a 0.4 MOA elevation shift between groups 1 and 2. Windage shift was pretty minimal between the 2 groups at 0.07 MOA. And then between the first and third group, there was a 0.88 MOA elevation shift and a 0.5 MOA windage shift. So a 150 feet per second velocity difference and less than 1 MOA point of impact shift. Hopefully, that would be the worst case scenario between different lots of this ammo at 100 yards. But of course, the difference in velocities will also have implications as to POI changes if you're shooting at further distances. All right, so next we're going to compare the AAC 77 grain OTM to some other loads to see how it stacks up. And we're going to start with AAC 75 grain BTHP Match. All right, so as far as I can tell, the 75 grain BTHPs have a pretty decent reputation as far as AAC ammo goes. It doesn't seem to be quite as popular as the 77 grain OTM, and it's also a little bit more expensive than that load, but I tend to hear some positive things about it from time to time. I bought this lot of ammo in July of 2025, the same time as I bought the second lot of the 2550 feet per second version of the 77 grain OTM. Anyway, shooting felt fine on my end. Wind wasn't much of a factor. The Mantis missed quite a few shots for whatever reason, but the Garmin picked up the velocity on every shot, and thank goodness that it did, because we have quite a lot to talk about with these velocities. So we'll finish up and then talk about it. Here is the overview of the velocity numbers, and this ammo is rated at 2,700 feet per second out of a 20-inch barrel, and the red right-hand 20-inch H-bar had an average velocity of 2,817 feet per second. So that's 117 feet per second faster than it should be. And the BCA barrel had an average velocity of 2,841 feet per second, or 141 feet per second faster than it should have been. Both standard deviations were really bad as well, at 33 feet per second and 38 feet per second. Looking at the individual shot data, the velocities were all over the place. The red right-hand barrel had an extreme spread of 129 feet per second, and the BCA was at 180 feet per second. But even with all that, the single biggest issue that I have with all this is shot 21 for the BCA barrel. That shot had a velocity of 2,932 feet per second. That's 232 feet per second faster than it should have been, which is crazy hot and very concerning that it could be that far off from where it should have been. I did collect and look at the brass afterwards, and there were definitely some pressure signs on there. Not the worst that I've seen, but definitely concerning enough that if I had any more of this lot of ammo, I would have asked PSA to warranty it, because I wouldn't feel comfortable shooting this stuff anymore. I feel like with velocities this high and erratic, and also with the pressure signs, that this was just a ticking time bomb. Anyway, the BCA group looks pretty bad, and kind of has some stringing from high left to low right, but the red right hand group looks pretty decent, I suppose. The BCA ended up with a 30-shot group size of 3.559 MOA, with a 30-shot mean radius of 0.985 MOA, which gives us an AZ score of 143 yards. And the red right hand did a decent amount better, with a 30-shot group size of 2.836 MOA, and a 30-shot mean radius of 0.596 MOA, which gives us an AZ score of 237 yards. Breaking things down into 10-shot groups, the average 10-shot group size for the BCA was 3.2 MOA, and the average 10-shot group size for the red right hand was 1.9 MOA. For all the groups that we've seen so far today, the 75 grain BHTPs group pretty similar to the 77 grain OTM lots out of the red right hand barrel, but the BCA barrel didn't like this ammo at all, and it shot the worst group so far. Alright, next up we're going to go shoot some PMC X-Tac Match 77 grain through the BCA barrel, and then we will compare that, as well as some other 77 grain loads that I had shot previously through both barrels, to see how AAC ammo compares to other brands. Alright, so I do not have a lot of experience with this specific load from PMC, but it ends up shooting pretty good out of this barrel. The velocity was really slow though, which we'll take a look at a little more closely in a bit, but since this ammo was a bit weak, it made for a better shooting experience. Despite the ammo being weak, ejection was a little bit farther forward than what I would have guessed, at around 2:30 to 3 o'clock. The gas port on this barrel is pretty big, so the combination of the large gas port and this ammo made for a pretty decent shooting experience. Anyway, shooting felt fine again on my end. Wind was calm, the Garmin picked up the velocity on every shot, and yeah, the group doesn't look too bad. So we will finish up here and then take a closer look. The PMC X-Tac Match 77 grain OTM is rated for 2,420 feet per second out of a 16-inch barrel, and I got 2,589 feet per second out of this 20-inch barrel, with a pretty poor SD of 27 feet per second. The individual data looks fine to me, and the group looks pretty solid, with a nice central cluster, with a few other shots spread out high, left, and right. Group numbers look pretty good, with a 30-shot group size of 2.212 MOA and a 30-shot mean radius of 0.535 MOA, which puts the AZ score at 264 yards. And the average 10-shot group size ended up at 1.6 MOA. Okay, next we're going to look at some numbers and compare the AAC 77 grain OTM to some other 77 grain loads from IMI, Federal, and PMC. Starting with the velocities, the IMI Razor Core got the fastest velocity out of all the 77 grain ammo that I've shot so far, which isn't too surprising. And then compared to the Federal Gold Medal, the AAC 77s are mostly faster than the Federal, but how much faster depends on the lot. Some lots were barely faster, and other lots were about 100 feet per second faster. And then the PMC X-Tac Match was the slowest of the 77s in this comparison. Moving on to the groups, this shouldn't be too surprising, but the Federal Gold Medal has put up the two best groups by a decent margin for these barrels out of all of the 77 grain loads, with AZ scores in the lower 300s. The PMC X-Tac Match and the IMI also did pretty good, with AZ scores in the mid 200 range. And the AAC 77 grain OTM was mostly in the lower to mid 200 range, with one group scoring a bit higher than that, and two groups being a bit worse, with AZ scores in the 180s. But all these numbers ignore the AAC's greatest asset, which is how cheap it is. When looking at the price, I think a better comparison would be against something like an M193 or M855, instead of more expensive ammo with a 77 grain Sierra Match King, particularly after seeing the inconsistencies in the velocity numbers between lots, as I wouldn't have a whole lot of confidence engaging long-range targets if I had to juggle different lots of the AAC. So there is a lot to consider when deciding if this ammo might be appropriate for whatever you plan to use it for. Alright, next up we're going to go grab a few more velocity readings from different barrel lengths using the October lot of AAC 77 grain OTM, since I still had some of that ammo left over. First up is a 10.5 inch barrel from Odin Works. It's 416R stainless, with a 223 wild chamber and 1-8 twist. And for all you in the comments, yes, the lower is SBR'd. Next is a 12.5 inch barrel from Alpine Research. It's made from nitride treated 4150 and has a 5.56 NATO chamber and 1-8 twist. This one is a 14.5 inch Centurion Recce barrel with a 5.56 NATO chamber, 416R stainless, and 1-7 twist. Here is the 16 inch Roscoe Purebred again with a 223 wild chamber and 1-8 twist. And last, here's an 18 inch 416R stainless barrel with a 223 wild chamber and 1-8 twist. And here's a look at the data chart for those of you who are interested in the details. And here's a graph, which is a little bit easier to look at. There are no real surprises here. All of the velocities look to be in the ballpark of where I would expect them to be, without any unexpected jumps or dips in velocity. As a reminder, most of these velocities are based on 5 shots, so they are not the most robust numbers. But this section was easy enough to do, so I figured it wouldn't hurt to include this information with the rest of the video. And that about does it for my experience with AAC 77 grain OTM. You can let me know in the comments if this matches up with your experience with this ammo, or not, and where this ammo might fit in with your use case, or why you might decide to use something else. Make sure that you're subscribed, because I have a lot more content on the way. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Later.